Welcome to the second part of Chapter 6. We'll be covering families and then looking a little bit at play and at media. So let's begin with families, and these are the topics we'll be covering: parenting, child maltreatment, a little bit about birth order, and the changing family and the changing society. So, parenting first. And there's a few facts here about parents compared to non-parents. They tend to be more satisfied with their lives. They feel better on a daily basis. So there is some evidence that parenting does contribute somewhat to life satisfaction, but it isn't extremely strong evidence. Make sure you do read this section though, and I'm going to move on to Diana Baumrein's parenting styles. So Baumrein came up with or published this at least in 1971, and we still rely on these categories when talking about parenting. So it's this this classification system has really kind of stood the test of time. It's been about 50 years now that's been around. And Diana Baumrein talks about four main styles of parenting, and we'll go through them here. The first is authoritarian parenting. As it says, parents exhort children to follow directions and to respect their work and effort. Um, it authoritarian parenting tends to have very rigid rules in place. Uh, there's punishment typically and often anger when rules are broken. Um, it allows little verbal exchange. The parents aren't that interested in the child's opinions or particularly as it applies to, as it pertains to any kind of rules or norms within the family. So the parents lay down the rules. They're expected to be followed. There are punishments when rules are broken. Typically, or at least often harsh punishments. Uh, this is what I think of as military style parenting. Kind of a analogy, I guess. And you don't question your commander. You follow their orders. This is associated with children's social incompetence. So I said that it allows little verbal exchange. I mean, the children tend not to feel really listened to within the family system, and so they often will be less talkative. They'll clam up. It's not uncommon for children to be somewhat shy if they have authoritarian parenting. It's also linked to children's higher level of aggression, and this should not be surprising. I mean, they learn through this system that punishment and particularly harsh or physical punishment is a way to deal with controlling those that are smaller and less powerful than yourself. And so there is, aggression is basically modeled in this approach. Um, okay, second major type of authoritative parenting. This encourages children to be independent, but still places limits and controls on their actions. So limits and controls mean there are rules in place, just like there was for authoritarian parenting, but typically the punishments are not as harsh, and they're dealt with less anger than in the authoritarian style. Um, there is more verbal give and take allowed, rather than the authoritarian parenting where rules are just handed down. The authoritative parent will listen to the children's input or the teenager's input about the rules and about certain situations. Exceptions will be made to the rules. So you may have a standard bedtime, but the child asks if they can stay up later this one night. You will listen to the reasons why they want to, and you may or may not grant them the privilege of staying up past their bedtime. Whereas in an authoritarian style, it wouldn't even be a discussion. So you children feel like they have a voice, that they can offer their input, that they can request changes to rules or exceptions at times, and that the parents will always consider what they have to say. And this tends to make the children feel like they have a voice. They tend to be more socially responsive and adept within the family system, and this will often carry over to there's the social relationships. So it is associated with social competence and children being more pro-social. And this style is also associated with something we talked about in the first part of this chapter, being an emotion coaching parent. And once again, remember, emotion coaching parents, they talk to children about emotions, and they coach them on how to deal with them, and it's much more likely that um, an emotion coaching parent is one that uses an authoritative style parenting. Um, okay, and the third style is neglectful parenting, and it is as it sounds. The parent is uninvolved in the child's life. This could be for many possible reasons, but there is something else that the parent is focused on, rather than the child. It may be a parent that just didn't want to be a parent, and so they have no interest in conducting parenting. It may be a parent that is um, is addicted to some kind of drug, and so the drug addiction takes their focus over the child, and they neglect the child. In some cases, the parents may be involved in, for instance, in a business or something like that, where that takes all of their energy and focus, and they go early to work, and they come home late at night, and the whole day is spent, running this business, and so once again, it's something else besides parenting and besides the child that's taking their focus, and so the child ends up being neglected. Um, this sometimes happens also in very well-off families where the the parents themselves are neglectful because they have hired help, nannies or other caregivers that are hired to look after and raise the children. So that the parents are neglectful, even though there may be a very um, caring nanny in the system, but the parents are neglecting the children. Okay, it's associated with children's social incompetence, lack of self-control, and lack of self-control is because if they're being neglected, they haven't really had to follow any rules and learn to follow, you know, rules and norms of society. Uh, Children often externalize problems; they lash out um, with aggression or with property destruction or other types of externalizing issues. Finally, we have indulgent parenting. Parents are highly involved with their children but place few demands or controls on them. Um, I my analogy, I mean, I don't know if it's fair, but the way I think of this is like a hippie style parent, and not to put down hippies or anything like that, but kind of like, you be you, child, you do what you want and be free, and I'm not going to control you, and they may be very very loving towards their kids, but just don't feel like imposing rules or don't believe in imposing rules on the children. So the children are just given tremendous freedom. And often the parents have very, very good intentions and uh, and feel like what they're doing is the right thing with their children. So once again, I mean, these are often very loving parents, so but don't believe in rules and limits. And so this is often associated with children's social incompetence. Once again, when children aren't made to follow rules and norms, then they're not very good in social situations, and and learning how to properly engage with others. They can be very bratty, for instance, because they're not used to answering to any authority figures. Lack of self control is very common. It's associated with children not respecting others. and like I said, brattiness comes into play here. Um, and the children may be domineering, egocentric, non-compliant, and have difficulty with peer relations. Okay, so this is a child that eats what they want to during their every meal. They control when they do their homework or if they do it without supervision. They stay up to whatever time they want at night. So there's no bedtimes in place. I mean, basically they make a lot of decisions themselves, and and it does often have negative consequences of not learning how to fit in a social way with others. Okay, so we have 4 styles, and they can fit nicely into this little chart here. I like this chart to keep these styles organized. I mean, so we have 2 major variables that lead to the 4 styles. Along the top, you have accepting, responsive versus rejecting or unresponsive. So that's one variable. Is like how accepting and responsive are the parents to the children. And the second variable over on the left side, you see demanding, controlling versus undemanding or uncontrolling. So that's are you setting rules and limits for the child? That's what she means by being demanding or controlling. And so you get the 4 styles with the authoritative. You know, certainly it's called demanding and controlling because as an authoritative parent, you certainly have rules in place. You have limits and rules for your children. But you are accepting and responsive, meaning that you also listen and have verbal give and take with the child, so the rules can be bent or exceptions can be made at times. Whereas the authoritarian, they're also demanding control, and there are rules, but they are rejecting and unresponsive. There's no bending of the rules. And then we get down to the bottom two, and these are ones that have these 2 styles both have very few or no rules in place or limits for the children. But the indulgent parents are considered accepting and responsive. Like I said before, they might be very loving parents. They do listen to the kids. They talk to them a lot, but they don't have any demands or expectations for the child, and don't put rules in place. The neglectful parents don't do anything. They're not. They have no rules, no limits. They're rejecting and unresponsive. I mean, they're basically not really in the child's life very much. Anyway, so you get these 4 styles, and you can think of these variables rather than just 4 different discrete styles. You can think of this as a graph. I'm going to go to my annotations here. Okay, so you can think of this graph like we have this on the left side here. The further up you go on the graph, that means the more demanding and controlling you are, and going from left to right, the more to the right you are, the more rejecting and unresponsive, the more to the left, and more accepting and responsive. So you get this graph, and we can box it into these 4 styles. But understand that one, there might be one parent that's here and another parent that's over here. Now they both end up being called authoritarian, but the one on the right is much more rejecting and unresponsive. This one, the first X I drew, they may still be authoritarian, compared to authoritative parents, but they're close to the line, meaning that they do sometimes listen to their kids and they have some verbal give and take. They may still end up in this box, but certainly this parent on the left compared to the parent on the right is going to have better outcomes for their children. So you can be at different points in these, and you can also, be a parent that kind of straddles 2 boxes. So I'm actually somewhere close to this X. I consider myself authoritative as a parent, but sometimes I'm a little bit indulgent. I don't think I'm right on the line. I'd like to think I'm maybe up here somewhere. But the point being that you could be on this line, or you could be on this line over here. And so this is kind of, you can think of this as a graph with outcomes, at different points throughout the graph, leading to different parenting styles. Okay, I know these are sloppy X's, and And so it's not just that, we break things down into 4 styles, but there are comparisons of parents within each style. Are they more or less rule oriented? Are they more or less accepting and responsive? So it's a good way to think about it. Okay, let me clear my drawings here. Oh, good, that works. And get rid of this. Okay. Parenting styles in context, a little bit more about parenting styles. We, in our society and in most societies in the world, authoritative parenting is considered the preferable style, has the most benefits for the child and the family. Certainly our style is oriented around that, and I mean, our culture, is oriented around that kind of style as being the best. And just I do want to point out that how there are some ethnic groups where the authoritarian style can be associated with positive outcomes. I kind of spoke of it negatively. It's very rule oriented. It can be very strict. But some societies and cultures, it fits their particular culture and society. So in the Arab world, the parenting is very authoritarian. That is their culture. You would not do well in that culture to have an authoritative style. Asian American parents are considered somewhat authoritarian, but they use what's called a training induction technique with their children, and the rule orientation is a training technique to teach the children how to fit in properly within their culture. Remember, um, most Asian cultures are more collectivist oriented, and you have a certain place that you're supposed to kind of occupy within the group, within the culture, and any groups you belong in. And it's kind of like you have a place in society. And so parents have to sometimes be more authoritarian and rule oriented to teach children how to grow up to properly fit into society and know the customs and whatnot that surrounds their place in society. And otherwise they will not do well. And so there is there are some there are some cultures that really use somewhat more of an authoritarian style, and it's acceptable in the culture. Okay. Hey, consistent parenting is recommended. Flexibility in style is warranted depending on the situation. Some parents do certainly switch from more or less one style to another, depending on the particular circumstances. They may be more authoritarian when it comes to certain issues, like perhaps alcohol or drugs or something. They're very fixed and rigid in their parenting, and they may be more authoritative and the easy one when it comes to maybe homework or bedtime. So depending on each situation, you may adjust your parenting somewhat depending on how important that topic is and how rigid your views are on it. Most research on parenting styles does look at mothers. Fathers tend to be more authoritarian. So, we may have more authoritarian parenting going on if we were to take into account the father's style more so than the mother's. Mothers have been studied more because mothers really tend to run households in our culture and tend to be kind of the main managerial parents. To manage their children on a daily basis. So they do get studied more. We want consistent parenting styles if possible, and it means you want both parents having similar styles and agreeing on things. Punishment. This is I'm actually going to let you read this, and I'm going to skip it because I actually plan to talk about this in our 1 hour face Zoom lecture time on Monday. So I'm not going to go over it now. You can read about it in the book, and if you attend Monday's lecture, you will hear me talk about this in class somewhat. Child maltreatment. So there are four major types of child maltreatment. Physical abuse is obviously infliction of physical injury on a child. Child neglect is, the child's basic needs are being neglected. There's many ways this could happen. The child's not eating properly. Um, I don't know, parents aren't home, and a lot of times and leave the child alone at home. At a younger age, that would be considered neglect. Um, Child's always wearing dirty clothes, let's say, would be a sign of neglect. Also, things like if the child's not attending school on a regular basis, this could be considered child neglect by the parents. If the medical needs of the child are not being properly managed and cared for, then that would be a form of child neglect. So it's a wide ranging category. And by far, it's the most common category of the four. Um, okay, the third category is sexual abuse, and this obviously includes sexual acts with a child, but it would also include exploitation of a child through such things as maybe prostitution or production of pornography would also be considered sexual abuse. And then finally, we have emotional abuse. And this, I don't know, just as an example, maybe a parent repeatedly calling a child fat and worthless throughout their life, yeah, harming the child's self-esteem and well-being, emotional well-being. Um, this emotional abuse is the hardest to investigate. There's no clear signs of it. You would look for like a child maybe being really withdrawn and socially inept as signs, but these signs obviously aren't as clear as you can find with some of the other forms of abuse. Um, so it is investigated the least of these, but even though we believe it's present the most, I mean, um, emotional abuse is often shows up in combination with any of these other types. If you're physically abusing a child, you're probably emotionally abusing them as well. If there's sexual abuse, I mean, there's certainly emotional abuse as part of this, as part of sexual abuse. So neglect, it can also be seen as a form of emotional abuse. So it doesn't get investigated as much, but it is often present in combination with other types of abuse. Okay. Context of abuse, very briefly here. Among the family and family associated characteristics that may contribute to maltreatment are parenting stress, um, substance abuse among the parents, social isolation of the family, single parenting makes it more likely, and also socioeconomic difficulties. It is more likely in lower SES families compared to mid or high SES families, although it does exist at every level. So all these are just some things that make it more likely to occur. And finally, the other thing that makes it more likely is if parents were abused themselves as children. About a third of them go on to abuse their own children, so it does get passed down. And often, parents that are abusers were often abused themselves as children, and so that ended up forming part of their mental model when they were a kid. That this is one of the things parents do. They hit you, or they do this to you, or they do that to you. I mean, like, we form a mental model as children, and we kind of learn about parenting from how our parents treat us. And then when we have our own children later, we often apply that mental model. Even sometimes on an unconscious level, we just tend to follow. This is what being a parent is. Uh, these are all developmental consequences of abuse. They're all associated with child maltreatment. Um, I don't need to go through this. You can read this list on your own. But all of these are more likely with children that have been maltreated. Birth order. we will look at a couple of little things here. But before I even get into the birth order effects, I do want to point out that birth order is now considered to have very limited ability to predict behavior. It was once a very popular topic in psychology, particularly if you go back into, if you go back 100 years or, between 50 and 100 years ago, it showed up in so many studies. So many studies were concerned with birth order and the effects. But what we've come to realize and believe is with newer research is that it's just not a powerful enough variable to really give any weight to. There are so many other factors that influence the development of children more so than which order they were born in. So this is considered a minor factor now, and it's far less researched than compared to in the past. And anyways, what we do based on the research that has been done, we tend to know that it's somewhat more likely that, as it says here, compared with later born children, firstborn children tend to be more adult-oriented, helpful, conforming, and self-controlled, whereas later born are more rebellious and more liberal-spirited. So those are just some broad strokes. Firstborns are also called achievement-oriented. Similarly, as you can see, so are only children, but not surprisingly, only children are also firstborns. So both first and only children tend to be more achievement-oriented. And only children have also been described as having desirable personality characteristics. Research has changed from the past when only children were considered socially disadvantaged. They tended to find negative outcomes associated with being an only child. And this may make sense because when the research was being done, like I said, 50 to 100 years ago, a lot of research was done. It was much more rare to be an only child. And so you were kind of already a social outcast because you were an only child, and that was so much rarer. Now it's very much accepted. And so there's not, the outcomes associated with it tend to be more positive, partially because it's just not, there's no negative stigma associated with it like there used to be. Okay, so let's go on. That's all I want to say about birth order. Once again, we don't consider it a very important variable that has limited power to predict behaviors in children. I can go through a few different family structures fairly quickly. Working parents is obviously the norm now. More than one out of every 2 U.S. mothers with a child under 5 is in the workforce. So the majority of mothers with young children do work in the U.S. The one positive result that's been found is that children of working mothers engage in less gender stereotyping and have more egalitarian views of gender. That means, basically equal views of gender than do children in non-working mothers. So that is a benefit. The children grew up to see the genders more equally when they have both a working mother and father at home. Okay, that's all I need to say there. This is just pointing out that the U.S. has one of the highest percentages of single-parent families in the world. So you can see us ahead of a lot of other comparable countries, but we do have a lot of single-parent families. And this is with those that have children under the age of 18. Obviously, one way that single-parent families are made, they don't have to be from divorced families. They may have been single. They may have been never married single parents, but we also do have a high divorce rate, and this also leads to single-parent families. Those that come from divorced families show overall poor adjustment than those that come from intact, never divorced families. Yeah. That's all I'm going to do there. Many of the problems that children experience after parents divorce date to before the divorce. So it's not necessarily the divorce itself. So when we say that first line there that overall they show poor adjustment, those who divorced families, usually it's usually the reason is that there was something that led to the divorce. Often conflict within the family is what led to the divorce in the first place. And it's really the conflict between the parents that lead to the poor outcomes. When they do research on children from divorced parents, where the parents had no real conflict or at least did not expose the children to any conflict, these those children have very positive outcomes. I mean, very comparable outcomes to children that come from intact families. So it's not the divorce itself that causes the problems. It's not like, are my parents divorced, yes or no, leading to having problems. It's what led to the divorce. Was there conflict between the parents? And if so, that's usually what causes the problems with the children. All right. What else do I want to go over here? So there's a few points. Frequent non-custodial parent visits benefit children. So whoever doesn't have custody should have frequent and short. So they should tend to be frequent and short visits, especially for younger children. Those tend to be best. Children with difficult temperaments have more problems coping with divorce. Those with easygoing temperaments have an easier time. Co-parenting after the divorce helps children adjust. Co-parenting just means that you're on the same page with your ex-spouse. You have similar rules in place and similar expectations for the child. If you can work as a team, as co-parents, following a divorce, it just improves the outcomes dramatically for the children. If you can put aside your differences and your conflicts, and then once again, the outcomes can be very good for the children. There is more of a loss of income for mothers following a divorce than for fathers. Custodial mothers experience a loss of about 25 to 50% of their pre-divorce income on average. Somewhere between 25 to 50% of their pre-divorce income. And whereas custodial fathers, they show a loss of about 10% of their pre-divorce income. And when we say a loss of income, it's not that they're losing their jobs or getting paid less, but as far as disposable income, I mean, there are just so many more expenses, and it tends to be more so true of mothers than of fathers. I mean, so there obviously after following a divorce, there's certainly an extra residence. There may be an extra car being bought. I mean, like, things just aren't split anymore. There are more sitters needed, more daycare and child care facilities and things like that. So this is what causes the money issues following a divorce. Then we have gay and lesbian parents. I don't have a lot to say here because the evidence, the experimental evidence, and the evidence from correlational studies and whatnot, is pretty clear that there are very few differences in children that grow up in a gay or lesbian household versus in a heterosexual family-headed household. So I mean, like, the differences that have been found tend to be very small and inconsistent. Overall, the majority of research shows no real differences. But it doesn't matter if your parents are two men, two women, or a man and women. Your outcomes are basically the same. This includes sexual orientation as well. Gay or lesbian parents do not raise their kids to become gay or lesbians themselves. It's no more likely than children coming from a heterosexual couple, because we don't determine sexual orientation by how we raise kids and by our own sexual orientations. There's no differences in peer relations in children from gay and lesbian versus heterosexual parents. There's no differences in mental health adjustment. So basically, few to no differences. Okay, let's just leave it at that. Lower SES parents versus mid SES parents. There's a comparison over the next two slides. So these are things that are more associated with lower SES parents. They're more concerned that the children conform to society's expectations. This is one of the reasons that they're more likely to be authoritarian. Is they want their children to follow certain rules. They create a home atmosphere in which it's clear that parents have authority over children. They use more physical punishment, and they're more directive and less conversational. A lot of these fit with what I was talking about earlier about authoritarian parenting, which is certainly more prominent in lower SES households. More rule-oriented, more physical punishment, etc. In higher SES parent households, they are more concerned with developing children's initiative and delay of gratification. So skills that will be useful throughout their development. They're less likely to use physical punishment. They create a home atmosphere in which children are more nearly equal participants, in which rules are discussed, very much authoritative. What I was talking about with authoritative parenting, it's give and take, the children are listened to, and it's less directive and more conversational. They talk with the children. So, and these are, once again, they're overall, they're not going to apply to every single person in these circumstances, but these are overall differences between low SES and higher or mid to high SES parents and when they raise their kids. So certainly there are some major differences in these households that the children experience. Two more topics are going to be play and media. So let's talk about play first. And play therapy is something that came about really following some views of Freud and Erikson. They both wrote about how play helps a child master anxieties and conflict. Freud and Erikson, first of all, Freud initially noticed that children would often act out. They would act out things that were distressing to them or causing them anxiety. So an example would be a child, was really scared when they go to get a needle from the doctor, and then they might come home and do some pretend play where it involves a doctor and a patient, and they kind of act it out in their playtime. And so, and Freud noticed that that children do this, and they can act out things safely with pretend play in order to kind of overcome the stress and anxiety of some real life situations, like going for a needle, for instance, from the doctor. Anyway, so this was noticed by Freud and Erikson. They both wrote about it. So this kind of led to play therapy being developed. That if children are acting out their anxieties and their stresses through playtime, we can use this to find out what's really disturbing and bothering a child. And so it helps the child to work off frustrations, to play through something anxiety provoking, like a doctor visit, and it helps them, the therapist, to analyze what it is that's bothering a child. Okay, secondly, play provides important context for development of language and communication skills. This was noticed by both Piaget and Vygotsky in their writings. They both wrote about how play advances cognitive development. Both Piaget and Vygotsky thought that pretend play was incredibly important for learning communication skills, because a child with dolls, they'll have the dolls communicate with each other. They'll have dolls at different levels, like a parent and a child communicate in their playtime. They actually learn language skills through their pretend play, and especially if they do it with other children, something that Piaget called sociodramatic play. Doing pretend play with others where you're both involved in the same story. This really advances their communication skills. So Freud and Erikson thought play was important. Piaget and Vygotsky thought it was important as well. But in today's society, children tend to have less unstructured play. than any time in the past. Many developmental experts feel like children need more unstructured playtime. And when I say unstructured, you know, unstructured time where the children are free to engage in just pretend play, to play with dolls and to act out little things rather than having it structured as far as watching a television program or playing a structured game. They need unstructured play as well. Just go outside and play in the backyard kind of play. And we do have a lot less of this in society now. As our society has changed, parents have become less willing to let their children wander around neighborhoods and outside without being supervised. Uh, Certainly, when I was a child, I had a lot more freedom than I would give my daughter now. I have to admit. So, like, our society has changed. We've become more aware of dangers that exist, and we're more protective of our children, and so they do get less unstructured, unsupervised playtime. Okay, let me go on. Types of play. It's just a list of different types of play. I'll go through this fairly quickly. Sensory motor play. This kind of comes from, remember, Piaget's sensory motor stage. This is where infants derive pleasure from exercising their existing sensory motor schemas. So this does come from Piaget, and he says that it's a form of play when an infant just is learning to kick their leg in a certain way or move their arm in a certain way, and this is why they will repeat these actions over and over while laying in their crib. They're playing by just learning how to move their limbs. Hey, eventually they will be able to do more. Their play might involve crawling towards things or rolling over or eventually walking and running. Okay. Practice play. Anyways, okay, the sensory motor, let's just say like it's visual and motor skills are being exercised. Practice play involves a repetition of behaviors of a behavior once a new skill is learned. So this is what children do to learn new skills. I'm talking about it a little bit with the infant kicking their leg over and over. I mean, that could be seen as practice play. For a preschooler, it'd be something like jumping over a puddle again and again because they've learned how to jump. Or they might just run around after they start gaining the ability to run. I mean, preschoolers love to run back and forth and just they have no real purpose. It's just running because they like it. So it's a form of practice play. There's no rules or anything like that. Pretense or symbolic play is transforming physical environments into symbols. This is basically what I refer to as pretend play. So you might hold up a block and pretend it's a phone. You put it against your head. Oh, I'm talking to my daddy or whatever. And so you're using blocks and other toys to symbolize things. You're using dolls to symbolize real people. That's pretense, symbolic play. Social play involves interaction with peers. Once again, Piaget, one of the names he gave it was social dramatic play. It's like pretend play with others. Then we have constructive play, just means that you are creating some kind of product or solution. So building a castle with blocks is a form of constructive play. And then we have games. This is kind of an older style of play. I mean, you don't do a lot of games except for the most, simplest games as a preschooler, but certainly in your elementary school years, games become more popular as children have the cognitive ability to follow rules and so you do more board games and as well as physical games that have rules. These games often obviously involve competition between two or more people. Okay, let me go on. And this I'm not going to go through. These are benefits of play. How they benefit you cognitively, what kind of things does it affect, how it benefits your social emotional development. So a long list of benefits of play. And finally, we have media, television and media. young children's media use has certainly dramatically increased. There's no denying that. Here it's comparing 2011 to 2013, but almost any 2 years you compare. I mean, it's been the use of just technology in general has been increasing. Including playing games, using apps, watching videos, TV, movies, computer time, etc. Okay, many 2 to 4 year olds spend 2 to 4 hours per day watching TV, more time than they spend with their parents, which is a little concerning. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends for 2 to 5 year olds that they should watch a maximum of 1 hour of TV per day, and it should be selective, high quality programs such as Sesame Street or some other educational PBS shows. And there are more and more quality educational shows that are available. Don't let your kids just watch anything. I mean, it's not hard to find educational programming now compared to the past. And certainly my time growing up, I think Sesame Street was, there was one of just a tiny number of educational programs that were on TV. Anyway, so our youngsters are watching more TV than the experts would like, the American Academy of Pediatrics. They've shown in research that children never, even if it's educational TV, they never learn as much as they would interacting with a real person. So interacting with a parent, for instance, that they will always learn more from a parent than they could from any TV show, at least at these younger ages. There are some positives from educational media. You can teach children positive pro-social behavior. Sesame Street does this a lot. Teach children to be kind to one another and to share and things like that. It is linked with higher obesity rates in children and adolescents. When you're watching more TV, you are more stationary, obviously, and many people do eat while they watch media, so this also contributes to weight gain. And one long-term association is between television watching, particularly, or I should specifically say, watching aggressive or violent television, and it's linked to violent or aggressive behavior. And studies have found this. Certainly, Saturday morning cartoon shows, one study found, have an average of more than 25 violent acts per hour. A typical Saturday morning cartoon show, 25 violent acts per hour that children are being exposed to. And so this link, I should update it too to say that this link has also been found with violent or aggressive video games and behavior. So there is this link that's been found, and it is a pretty consistent link that children that watch more aggressive TV show more aggressive behavior. I'm gonna point out one study that demonstrates this, and this was an experimental study. It was done by Steuer, Applefield, and Smith. Steuer is spelled S-T-E-U-R, S-T-E-U-R. And then Applefield is one word, and Smith. This was a 1971 study, and they had their experimental group was shown cartoons to watch containing violence. Their control group watched the same cartoons with the violent parts removed. So one group watched cartoons with violence, one watched cartoons without violence. And anyways, then they gave them a free play session. And during the free play session, the experimental group children showed more aggression than the control group children. So after watching aggressive television, they were more aggressive in their free time play. So they took this as evidence that exposure to TV violence caused aggression in the experimental group in this study. It was the exposure to the TV violence. And it's pretty hard to argue with. I mean, the assumption, once again, is that the groups are equal to begin with, and there's only one thing you change between the groups is the watching the violent cartoons, or you know, or only one group sees the violence, and then when given free time to play and not controlled in any way, they demonstrate more aggression. And so it's pretty hard to say that aggression comes from anything else. Um, this is just one. This was just one of many studies that have been done on this topic, and it's certainly something to think of if you are caregiving or parenting children. You really do need to be careful with the amount of violence that they are exposed to in video games and TV. And that concludes our Chapter 6 video lectures.